rights. A reminder before we get started, our panelists today will speak in both English and Spanish, and we have simultaneous interpretation available over Zoom. So I will say this next message first in English, then in Spanish. If you need interpretation, please click the interpretation button at the bottom of your Zoom screen that looks like a globe. Si necesitan interpretación, favor de dar clic en el botón de
If you need interpretation, click on the globe that it's on Zoom, and it looks like a globe.
This event is the fourth installment of our ongoing series, Decades of Damage Done, the Drug War Catastrophe in Latin America and the Caribbean. As you can tell by the name, the purpose of these panels is to bring together activists, researchers, survivors, and other voices from around the region to share with us and analyze the enormous negative impacts of different aspects of the war on drugs launched 50 years ago and led by the United States, and to identify solutions and alternative approaches consistent with protecting human rights and promoting public health. Today, we'll be looking in particular at how the drug war has promoted militarization and how this affects democratic governance in the region. Militarized enforcement has been a central feature of the war on drugs, with police forces adopting military tools and tactics and armed forces assuming direct roles in drug enforcement operations, bolstered by US pressure and US aid. Militarization has not diminished the drug trade, but has brought devastating consequences for human rights and worrying implications for civilian controls over the armed forces. We're fortunate today to have a stellar panel of guests to talk about these issues and offer recommendations. We're going to start off with 2 rounds of questions for our panelists, with about 8 minutes of time for each question. Then we'll open it up to questions and answers from the audience, which you can send in over the chat. To start off, we're going to hear from Juliana Miranda, who is a researcher on citizen security at the Center for Legal and Social Studies, CELS, in Argentina. Juliana is going to be sharing with us a big picture view of drug war-related militarization in the region, and we will be conversing in Spanish. Buenos días, Juliana.
Buenos días, Stephanie, and everyone.
Muchas gracias.
Good morning. Thank you for being here with us today. In the recently published report by CELS and the internal war, you say that the doctrine of these new threats was the backdrop in order to involve the armed forces in operations, law enforcement operations in Latin America, and that drug trafficking plays a central role in this doctrine. So given all this, we would like to hear a little bit about the expansion of the military power in the region. Why is it important? Why should we care if there is a change in the civil-military relationship? Could you talk a little bit about how the doctrine has unfolded in practice? What have been the consequences, the impact on drug trafficking, and the negative effects of drug trafficking, specifically violence? What type of impact has the expansion of the military power in the relations between the armed forces and democratic institutions? And what has been the implication of this military expansion in terms of human rights and public security, public safety? Thank you very much for all your questions and for your invitation. I'm going to speak slowly for the sake of the interpreters. Well, the doctrine of new threats says that given the absence of interstate wars or wars in the region, there is threats. The new threats would come from basically organized crime, transnational organized crime problems. In particular, here we would be talking about drug trafficking, which plays a key role here, a central role. Within this perspective, the armed forces should be retrained in order to face these issues. And these are not limited to drug trafficking, but the war on drugs would actually play a central role in the political and electoral agendas of many countries in the region. We've seen a lot of responses that were very punitive and security focused, and these responses have also involved the armed forces. Based on all this, we've seen different trends where here we see the militarization of security, and then also securitization of other agendas, more social agendas such as poverty, education, and so on and so forth. In this regard, we've seen certain consequences, and here we could be talking, for example, about capacity building in different countries to carry out intelligence operations, information exchange between the different agencies. All that is many times used with an excuse, the excuse of attacking criminal groups, but also they hinder the right to protest. Certain legislation changes have also been implemented in many countries in the region, and these changes actually bring the military forces the capability to be involved in security issues because they see these threats as affecting the security of the state, the democracy. We're talking about, for example, terrorists that put down planes. So basically, they provide impunity to the military and the police forces because of the operations that have taken place within this framework, security framework. In some countries where this type of deployment is more normal, we've seen also an institutionalization of certain spaces of joint tasks where we have the military, civilians, and other agencies such as migration agencies. Many countries have also deployed the military, and they say it's in exceptional cases, but in reality, the deployment takes place for a long period of time. We've seen, therefore, a very large expansion, a very accelerated expansion too of militarization. We all know and we agree that these type of measures tend to reproduce the dynamic of social violence that we so often see throughout the region. These phenomena that are so different cannot be addressed with the same strategy because they don't come in the same shape in all countries. Therefore, many times, this increase in violence has to do with an increase of the police lethal operations, of the use of firearms by criminal groups. Their armament becomes much heavier, much more violent. And in countries such as Mexico, we've seen an exponential increase of their murder rate. So here we can talk about a lack of effectiveness of this strategy in terms of reducing violence caused by drug trafficking. In addition to all this process entails other indicators on top of the use of the armed forces in security operations. Here we're talking about the type of equipment the police force uses, military tactics when the police is deployed, and the proliferation of new police forces that are militarized tactical groups within the police force that are basically undertaking an increasing number of functions that were played by traditional police forces in the past. Because of this, we've also seen an expansion of the armed forces over the political system and the social life in countries in the region. And we're talking about countries that have had very gruesome dictatorships, very long, and in democracies that are not so stable and not so old, all this has a very negative impact. Therefore, we can also say that the militarization provides greater autonomy to the armed forces. And like you said before, Stephanie, it tends to break the the balance between the civilian forces and military forces. We've seen a great impact on a series of rights. It has led to violations of human rights. We've seen executions, torture, enforced disappearances, as well as other rights such as the freedom of expression, the freedom of gathering, and so on and so forth. So we've seen a lot of implications, and the most marginalized sectors of society and the most impoverished one have been highly affected by it. Thank you very much, Juliana, for that overview of what you're seeing in the region. It is very striking to hear about this securitization, not only of the response to a problematic use of drugs or drug trafficking, but also to human mobility, to social problems. Basically, what you're saying is that militarization is not a response that you come up with thinking about the problem and then thinking about the most logical solutions. Quite the contrary, it's about looking for missions for the armed forces and basically based on this logic that you were talking about of social control. So we're not surprised about the lack of effectiveness by the militarization, but we are surprised about the decisions made by those in power.
Now we will switch back into English and move north to hear about the role in this process of the country that has led the war on drugs, the United States. My colleague Adam Isaacson, who is Director for Defense Oversight here at WOLA, is going to share with us a brief overview of US military aid and cooperation in the region and its impact in different countries over the past years. Adam, what has US aid to the region looked like over past decades, and what impact has US cooperation had on civil military relations in our hemisphere?
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, Juliana, for that great presentation, which I think I'll reinforce some of the points of in my presentation. I'm just going to share a few visuals with you. I mean, basically, the idea of the United States military playing a key role in the drug war developed in the 1980s, and then it was codified in law at the very end of the 1980s. A new section was added to the underlying law of the US military, making the military the single lead agency for overseas interdiction of drugs. And that was loosened in 1990 to mean that the Defense Department could even be in charge of several types of assistance to foreign militaries. Meanwhile, the State Department was offering even larger amounts of assistance at the same time. This is the late 80s, the height of the crack plague in the United States, the height of power of the Medellin and Cali cartels. This gave, at the end of the Cold War, the United States a new way to provide military assistance to the region where the communist threat was declining. In places like Mexico, it provided an opportunity to try to deepen what had been pretty distant relationships with militaries in places, especially like Mexico. The drug war very quickly became the #1 post-Cold War mission for the Pentagon and for the Southern Command in Latin America. It came to justify much of what became some very large increases in military assistance in the late 1990s and then again in the late 2000s. These big brand name aid packages like Plan Colombia and the Merida Initiative in Mexico were largely funded with counter-drug programs. And they also, during the 2000s and the Bush years, melded closely with the war on terror in Mexico, though with the focus more on transnational criminal organizations than just on terrorist groups. About 87% by my count of counter-drug aids in the last quarter century, of military and police aid from the United States in the last quarter century, about 87% of that aid was funded through programs created for counter-narcotics, which is quite a bit. Really, without those programs, US military assistance would be far, far smaller and mainly going through traditional military aid programs that do not have the counter-drug justification. The biggest of those is the State Department's International Narcotics Control and Law Enforcement Program, which is the biggest source of most years is the biggest source of any aid to the region. It funds it's sort of like a Swiss Army knife program. It can fund military assistance. It had funded the transfer of helicopters to Colombia and Mexico. It pays for lots of training in combat techniques, maintenance of equipment, but it also pays for things like sometimes alternative development programs, judicial reform programs, drug demand reduction programs. It is a giant program, and it is often hard to get detailed information about what exactly it's paying for. It's even harder to get information about the Defense Department's programs, which have changed names over the years. Right now, it is called the Section 333 Train and Equip program. And I would say that, for instance, in Mexico right now, probably more aid flows to Mexico's military through the $700 billion defense budget than flows through the State Department's budget. And it is very hard to get information about exactly what that's paying for. The biggest recipient over the years has been Colombia, about $8.2 billion to its military and police in this century, again, because of reporting inaccuracies, or rather in lack of specificity. It's often hard to say how much has gone to Colombia's armed forces and how much has gone to the police, but I go with the number 8.2 billion since just before Plan Colombia began. It's the second biggest has been Mexico, especially during the first few years of the Merida Initiative, when a lot of expensive equipment and aircraft were sent to Mexico. So, why should we be concerned about this aiding the military for this big internal mission of fighting drugs? I mean, obviously because of human rights impact. Militaries are not trained to work alongside a population. They're trained to defeat an enemy with overwhelming violence. The risk of corruption to the institution too. But I want to talk, as Juliana did, about the impact of pushing this big new military role on militaries, the impact that that has on civil military relations. Remember that Latin America and the Caribbean is a region that just 40 years ago was almost entirely governed by military dictatorships, or in countries like Mexico by dictatorships backed by their militaries. You had a hopeful moment in the 90s and the 2000s of transitions to democracy, civilian defense ministers, more control over things like budgets, getting the military out of policing and out of other jobs that civilians can do, back into the barracks. Now, US drug war programs ran counter to that trend. They created new things for militaries to do while being mixed in with the population: patrols, roadblocks, control of riverine and coastal traffic, aerial traffic, participation in forced eradication campaigns. I should have used a slide here of like manual eradication teams, which are a bit more military in Colombia, but still this idea of the military being involved in getting rid of crops. Going after the leadership of cartels and organized crime, the idea that the police are outgunned, so you need the military to go after the top leaders. All of this has badly blurred the distinction between what is a military force and what is a police force. A police, of course, a military, like as I said, is supposed to defeat an enemy with overwhelming violence. A police force is supposed to serve the population with minimal violence. It's also fed the sense that maintaining a large military was a necessary thing to do, even when there were no real defense threats to justify maintaining a big military. All this didn't really work. Violent crime rates remain very high nearly everywhere, higher than in the mid-90s. Latin America has 8% of the world's population and 33% of the world's homicides, even after such deep military involvement in internal security. You'd expect supply reduction to lead to higher street prices in the United States. Well, you would be wrong. There has not been, or there has at least not been supply reduction, because the price of cocaine on US streets, adjusted for inflation and purity, has never increased. Coca cultivation has not budged. To the contrary, it's higher than it's ever been. And after all these billions of dollars in assistance, there's really only 4 or 5 countries' security forces that have gotten any good at all at interdicting and seizing drugs going through their territory. A lot of this money, I don't know where it goes. It turns out that the military is just an inappropriate tool for dealing with a very complex adversary like organized crime. Fighting insurgencies like the FARC or Shining Path were a lot easier because they wanted to fight the armed forces. They wanted to combat with the state. They wanted to take power, whereas organized crime doesn't want that. They want to be left alone, and they would much rather not fight the state. They would much rather corrupt and penetrate the state and render it useless against it. And they've had a lot of success at doing that. When it's fought, organized crime often simply sort of breaks up and keeps going. This high value targeting, taking out top leaders, has led to fragmentation. This military first approach did not mean more governance or less impunity. It simply meant open spaces where more and more groups, once confronted, could form and split up while the flow of drugs remained the same. Obviously, organized crime has had some success in corrupting security forces. And I can't get into this in too much detail, but it remains a problem at the local and the national level in many places. More recently, the United States has sought to respond by creating vetted units within militaries and within police, sort of a mini military within the military whose members undergo background checks and drug tests and integrity checks. And in return, they have access to a lot of US intelligence databases and get specialized training. But these units have run into trouble too. In places like Guatemala, Mexico, Colombia, its members have collaborated with organized crime, collaborated with very violent groups that have committed human rights abuses, and in some cases even stolen seized cocaine to sell on their own. Now, the idea of giving the military more domestic things to do is catching on in a big way beyond the drug war in more recent years. We're seeing a real reversal of that hopeful moment of the 1990s and the 2000s when military rules internally were decreasing. More involvement against migrants, against environmental depredation. They're taking more control of prisons, and they're playing a more political role in many countries too, more openly supporting the political agendas of presidents like Bukele here in El Salvador in this photo, Bolsonaro, and of course, leaders like Maduro and Ortega becoming very politicized and lending themselves to populist authoritarian projects. And there's more protests around the region as inequality is growing, as the effects of COVID are increasing, and militaries are being pulled into this crowd control role that they are not at all trained for. I think we're in for a rough ride with civil-military relations around the region. Maybe not a return to the military dictatorships of the 1970s, but an important increase in the internal power of militaries within the young democracies of Latin America. And one outcome could be countries that are sort of nominally democratic, but where the generals have the civilians on a very tight leash, and they run a lot of non-defense ministries within the government. Sort of like what we saw in the very first years in the 1980s, when these countries were just starting to transition away from military dictatorship. We could go back to that sort of situation. Very politicized militaries that can't be held accountable for human rights, for corruption, and that can actually effectively ban some political outlooks or positions. I'm not saying this is all because of US support to the drug war over the last 40 years, but it didn't help. I wonder how much more healthy Latin America's civil-military relations would be today had the United States sought a more civilian, rule of law, and governance-based approach to drug control over the past 40 years. And I hope we can talk about later about what that approach might look like.
Thank you, Adam, for that extremely sobering and striking presentation. Those visuals really show very starkly how this militarized aid model has been in place for quite a long time. During all that time, evidence is building up, showing that it is a counterproductive model, puts human rights at risk, and yet year after year, we saw that model continue with this lack of transparency that you mentioned in much of the defense aid, which of course continues today. And especially, as both you and Juliana have mentioned, in the context of Latin America, with the history of the military's role in the region, I think we're really seeing how blurring those lines and expanding military roles and missions is a serious problem that could affect these young democracies, as you say. So certainly very concerning to hear that we're seeing a reversal of what had been perhaps a hopeful moment several years back in civil military relations. Expanding on some of what we've just seen in that presentation about militarization and the drug war in Colombia, now we'll turn to Arlene Tickner, who is a professor at the Universidad de Rosario in Colombia with expertise in security, violence, and peace-related topics. Arlene, thank you for joining us today. So apart from Afghanistan, where counter-narcotics was an aspect of a massive US military effort, the US has poured more military aid into Colombia in the name of the drug war than into any other country. In light of this, some of the questions we'd like to hear your thoughts on are, to what extent did US aid, through Plan Colombia and otherwise, alter or distort the Colombian military's internal roles and missions? Did that contribute to human rights abuses or weaken civilian control over the armed forces? What impact has this close US-Colombia military partnership had on Colombian drug production and trafficking? And how accountable are the armed forces to civilian institutions and the rule of law?
Thank you. I'm going to try to answer this wide array of questions in the 8 minutes that I have. Fortunately, Juliana and Adam have done a good job of doing some of my work, in particular by talking about militarization writ large and the US role in Colombia. I wanted to start before Plan Colombia, just mentioning that the Colombian context in general is characterized by the chronic institutional weakness of the state, which I think is a condition that adheres to much of Latin America. And in addition to this, a marked lack of appropriation by civilian leaders of security and defense matters. And this is reflected in the division of labor between political and military and police spheres that dates back way before Plan Colombia, pretty much to the 1960s with what's called the Lleras Doctrine. And this doctrine, while successful in limiting for some time the military's involvement in politics, had the other effect of limiting civilian participation in the work of the armed forces, leading to what I would call incomplete control and accountability. And so, although the armed forces in Colombia have actually been accountable to civilian institutions and to the rule of law in more formal terms, and most recently, because of the US role in the country, have become pretty much experts in human rights and humanitarian discourses. This is never obviously complete, given the lack of civilian leadership and control in this realm, and I would say significant military and police autonomy, which includes not only devising their own doctrines, but actually being the source of reform initiatives, as we're seeing today in Colombia. And so when we think about Plan Colombia within this specific context, I think one of the main changes that it introduced, beyond the goal of professionalizing, modernizing, and increasing the offensive capacity of the armed forces, was to increase military involvement in counter-narcotics, which both Adam and Juliana have mentioned. This was something that in the past, the Colombian army actually had been reluctant to do, given that it was deemed to divert from its main mission of counterinsurgency. And yet in the 1990s, this entanglement, increasing entanglement between the armed conflict and the drug trade in Colombia made this more justifiable, not to mention the fact that the army was eager to receive US funding along the lines allotted to the Colombian police before that, as Adam has showed in his graphs. And following 9/11, the narco-terrorist thesis, which was pushed largely by civilian leaders in Colombia, gained greater traction and allowed for higher levels of military assistance for the army. A second shift that I think didn't necessarily begin with Plan Colombia, but that was certainly intensified as a result, was the role of the armed forces in state building and state consolidation activities. I think this feeds into thirdly, the larger military involvement in policing activities related not only to counter-narcotics, which was obviously pushed by Plan Colombia, but in general, what I would call the politicization of the army that Juliana has referred to, in the sense that its roles following Plan Colombia have started to extend to many other areas. This whole notion of multi-missions following the peace accords in Colombia pretty much underscores this process. And I think Juliana's done a terrific job of explaining these different types of activities in which the military in Latin America and in Colombia, it's a good case, are increasingly involved. As I've already mentioned, then, civilian control over the armed forces in a robust sense is relatively weak in Colombia. One example is that we have civilian ministers of defense since the early 1990s, and yet pretty much none of them are experts on the topic. And they regularly adopt pre-existing logics of the military and the armed forces in general with little strategic vision and leadership. And similarly, the Congress, which would be the site for exercising accountability and control, exhibits limited interest in exercising any form of regulation. And instead of this, actually exercises a type of transactional logic, both with the military and the police in its activities. And so Plan Colombia, seen as a state strengthening project and not just a counter-narcotics one, and related strategies such as Uribe's democratic security policy, did worsen human rights abuses, largely as a result of the latter's body count mentality. And so I guess what I want to suggest is that the lack of civilian control, the weak, accountability of the armed forces, combined with this expansion of its role following Plan Colombia, and this whole notion of securing the country, have indeed fed into worsening human rights abuses on the part of the armed forces. And the most egregious example of this is, of course, the poorly called false positive scandal between 2002 and 2008, which resulted in the extrajudicial killings of over 6,000 young men at the hand of the army, presented as guerrillas killed in combat. This is a process that obviously the transitional justice system is currently going through with little accountability on the part of the army leadership to date. But this is, I think, one particularly worrisome result of U.S. participation in state strengthening and in counter narcotics in the country. And finally, Adam's pretty much talked about the failures of the drug war, but I just want to go back to this for a second. As he and others at WOLA and other institutions have shown throughout the years, the war on drugs in Colombia, in particular, in terms of intensive forced eradication of coca during the Uribe years, did put a temporary dent in coca cultivation and cocaine production, as his graph suggested to us. And yet, beginning in 2014, we notice an upward trend beginning again that's led to levels that are today even higher than when Plan Colombia began in 2000. And the claim that the peace process with the FARC is the main cause of this, which is essentially the argument of the right in Colombia, belies the fact that the drug war has been empirically proven by many to be an utter failure. In terms of dismantling criminal organizations involved in the drug trade, as Adam has also shown, the capture, killing, and extradition of scores of criminal leaders has not even put a dent in the business. An important leader of the Clan del Golfo in Colombia, Otoniel, was just captured last week, and the government has made a huge deal about how this is going to, fix security in Latin America, and essentially, marks the end of this important criminal organization. Well, this is obviously a false claim in light of the lack of progress in terms of this kingpin strategy that continues to be used in Colombia and in other countries. And so I would say, other than the continued militarization of counter-narcotics efforts and the criminalization of coca producers in Colombia, and the balloon and cockroach effects that Adam has shown us in his graph of Mexico that have led to the fragmentation and dispersion of criminal activities within Colombia and in other countries of the region and the Caribbean, the effects of the US role in terms of counter-narcotics have been quite marginal. In relation to resolving the problem. I would say that the policy has actually worsened the problem in terms of dispersing it, making it more fragmented, and as Adam has suggested, making it quite difficult to dismantle criminal organizations. And I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Arlene. So we're hearing now about the politicization of the army, along with, as already mentioned in Juliana's presentation, securitization of a broad range of social problems, and then added on to that, of course, tendencies to militarize police. So when we combine all of these tendencies that we're hearing about, this really raises concerns about what will happen with both military and civilian security forces if we continue down this road. And I think something else is really coming out in both Adam's and now Arlene's presentations is that both in Colombia and in some of the other countries of the region, how there can be symbolically a civilian government or a civilian minister or a civilian policy, but how the military may really be calling the shots and driving policy in a lot of these areas in a context of weak accountability for the armed forces. So the extent to which civilian or democratic institutions may be ceding their role in governance in a lot of areas is truly concerning. Finally, to finish our first round of questions, we're going to turn to a very important case study of the consequences of militarization in Mexico. The deployment of the military as Mexico's central strategy to combat organized crime associated with drug trafficking, but as Adam mentioned, increasingly with other crimes as well, has not led to lower levels of violence in Mexico. On the contrary, since Mexico intensified its militarized war on crime in 2006, annual homicides have more than tripled, and disappearances have surged, with more than 93,000 people currently recognized as disappeared and missing in Mexico. Militarization has led to widespread human rights violations, arbitrary detentions, torture, extrajudicial executions, enforced disappearances. And for the victims of these violations and their families, seeking justice can be an extremely difficult and dangerous task because historically military abuses in Mexico go unpunished, especially as regards the involvement of high-ranking military officials. And the military is known for being an opaque institution that operates with a high degree of autonomy. Despite these obstacles, the tireless fight of many families is what has made it possible for us to learn about some of these violations and has helped to advance the cause of accountability in very adverse conditions. So today, we are joined by two members of the Alvarado family from northern Mexico, Maria de Jesus and Nitza Citlali Alvarado Espinosa. I believe Maria de Jesus is going to speak with us today. You may recognize their family name because they took their search for justice all the way to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights when members of Mexico's army forcibly disappeared 3 of their relatives in December of 2009, Nitza Paula Alvarado Espinosa, Jose Ángel Alvarado, and Rocio Irene Alvarado Reyes. Today, we'll be hearing information about their case and their ongoing struggle for truth and justice. Buenos días, María de Jesús. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos. Nos gustaría escuchar.
Good morning, Maria Jesus Izitlali. Thank you very much for being with us here today. We would like to hear a little bit about what you've experienced since 2009. Mainly, we're interested in hearing not only about the facts of the case itself, but also that search for truth and justice based on the facts. What did it mean to look for the truth, to report what was happening, taking into consideration that you were talking not about just a normal person, but the Mexican army. And I would like to know if that has had an impact on your security and your relative security. Thank you very much for your invitation. Good morning. I'm Maria Alvarado. I'm the sister of Nitza and the cousin of Jose Ángel and Rocio. I think the life of our family changed radically when my brother and my cousins were disappeared. In this context of militarization that we were seeing in Chihuahua, in the state of Chihuahua, the President Felipe Calderón launched the war on drugs in 2008. We saw then the Operation Control Chihuahua under the 5th Battalion of Chihuahua. This took place after in El Ejido Benito Juárez, where my relatives disappeared. 3 federal police members actually disappeared. They were killed by drug traffickers. And because of that, 500 troops were sent to El Ejido Benito Juárez. We reported all this to each of the different government agencies. We were told that they knew that the army had carried out operations in El Ejido, but that's all we got. And then we're talking about 35th Battalion. We talked to them and they said that that battalion, that the army basically didn't arrest anyone. But 10 troops were seen in a van and they were seen to have Jose Ángel and my cousin. Jose Ángel was hit. The 10 soldiers hit him and both of them were taken away in another vehicle. Then they went to the house of Rocio Irene. They knocked on the door. The mom opened the door and they said that they were taking Rocio away because she was meant to be arrested. The town was being taken by the military. At that time, the military was patrolling the town. They were taking vehicles from people, basically. They were taking the vehicles from them, and then they were patrolling the town in those non-official vehicles. I remember that Rocio was working in a supermarket at the time. She was on her way on her way home. She would always pass by a hotel where the military were staying. This hotel was owned by people involved in drug trafficking that lived in that town. The drug traffickers left, and then the military took over the hotel. Rocio, whenever she was done with work, she would pass by that hotel, and she would say that whenever she was walking by the hotel, the military would actually chase her, say things to her. She called her grandfather that day because she was scared, and he went to pick her up and he took her home. But then the military showed up at her home and took her away. We denounced all this. We didn't get a response by the competent authorities, and we started collecting testimonies from people that had already been tortured, had already been arrested, taken by the military. As of 9 p.m., there was a curfew, and every person that they would see on the street was taken away. They claimed that they were looking for criminals, but those criminals were not in the town anymore. So we were not believed. They were saying that they wouldn't interfere with the military. The van that Nitsa had was taken away to be inspected. They said that the military had left it there, they didn't have any forensic experts, and that they would not interfere with the military operations. We also went to the Attorney General's office in Ciudad Juarez, and I remember that we were told that they knew it was the military who did that. At the time, the military was basically, if there was a case that involved the military, it was the military that would investigate the case, not a civilian. What I was told is that the military would carry out the investigation, they investigate each other, they cover each other, and that the civilians could not interfere, and that's why the office dropped the case. We fought a lot for this. We did not want to go to a meeting in the military base. We said that the military had to be investigated by a civilian authority, and we managed to do so. Now the military has to be investigated by the prosecutor's office. But anyway, at the time, the authorities were not doing anything. We started being threatened. We started to receive phone calls, and in those phone calls, we were told that if we continued to insist, we were all going to be killed. Sometimes we would be called to go to meetings in the special office for victims in Ciudad Juarez. And we had people come from Mexico, from the governor's office, and they would be they would take part in those meetings. In one of those meetings, they said that a former military whose last name was Sixto was going to join. And we were told the following: did you know that this house belonged to a very famous drug trafficker, and that there were 5 basements in that house? He said he would stomp with his feet on the floor, and he said, we have 5 basements in this house. And when he started saying that, we started saying, we're not here for that. We're here to know what happened to my family. This type of threat would take place all the time. The military would surround our house. I remember they would have lamps because it was dark at night, and we would ask them, what are you doing? And they would say, well, we're looking for stolen vehicles. And we knew that the military was had no business looking for stolen vehicles. It was their way of saying, we know that you live here, we know that you're here. So we were very scared, but we continued to report all these injustices. One of the reports was before the National Committee on Human Rights. Someone told us, and I remember Jaime Alvarado, Jose Angel's brother, reported this in the National Commission of Human Rights. They were the first ones who believed us. They came from Mexico City. We told them everything that had happened, everything that we had done so far in order to denounce everything that we suffered, that everything that had happened. They carried out an investigation. They came to the town. They went to Casas Grandes where the vehicle was. They visited the battalion. They came to Ciudad Juarez. And finally, in June, I believe it was on the 28th of June 2011, a recommendation was issued by the National Commission on Human Rights, where they said it's actually a recommendation number 43. Responsibility. They said that the responsibility was of the army, the federal police, and the government.
That recommendation was only accepted by the military and the state. And after that, on November 14th, or November 12th, rather, of 2012, we were given appointment in the National Attorney's Office with the military justice expert or attorney, and explained that our case was accepted because there were evidence of participation, but this did not mean that all the military are corrupt, but that they did acknowledge that these could be. And after that, they came to Chihuahua City and called the family members and representatives and decided to give compensation to the victims. The wife of Jose Angel received compensation. Litza Paola, who is my sister, had a compensation. They gave it to my father and the mother of Jose Alvarado. I remember that in that meeting, they did not want to have a registry of what was exchanged in that meeting. The military did not want that. So we received 180,000 pesos to each family, and it was given in cash. So there was no way to have like a registry of that exchange. And they just gave us a receipt when we asked for some kind of proof. So what they said that was that with that they had repaired the damage done, and we continue to be victims of threats, of harassment. And in this case, our case was submitted to the UN. It was submitted to the ICHR because it was a case that was heavily documented. And when it was so obvious from the government's perspective, or the government's actions were so obvious, that when the case was submitted to the court, the Inter-American Court on Human Rights, their decision was to call on the state, but the state could not demonstrate that it wasn't the military. They continue to say it was a criminal group, but it has been proven. And I remember that they submitted an answer saying that there had not been a report of this disappearance, that they had looked for the reports, but there were no reports. Fortunately enough, we had a copy of that report of a missing person, and we sent it to the court. And the Colonel Luano Luis, chief of battalion, was not part of that battalion, that he was not in the battalion 35. So we had actually a note that was published in the newspaper El Mexicano of Juarez City that stated he was. And in January 2010, it explained that he had been removed from his position. So there's an article that says that, yes, he's no longer head of that battalion, but he was actually part of that battalion before 2010. So these are this was a situation we lived in fear. I remember that we would travel between Ejido Benito Juárez to Casa Grandes to Juarez City. And in those travels, we were stopped on the road, asked to leave our car. And they always advise us to, every time we reach a checkpoint, to let our advisors know, or who our legal representatives know. And we had to call them and they would come in. And that's how we would live. You know, every time we took a road, we would have to avoid checkpoints. And we've managed to learn alternative routes, but we always traveled in a big group. So I remember that we would spend nights and days waiting outside of these offices, hoping to have an answer. In Casa Grandes, in the battalion, we weren't even allowed to access the building. I remember that investigators would were greeted with an order not to be allowed into the building. So that's why it was such an important case, because I think this case happened in this context of violence, of insecurity, and that's where the military takes control of the situation. And I think this is a case that reached the court because of the family, and the decision was issued on November 28, 2018, that condemns the Mexican state, in which the court recognizes that those responsible of my family's disappearance was the military. So the sentence has not been fulfilled, and we are asking for it to be satisfied. We have been waiting for already 3 years without knowing where our family members are. We continue to search for them. And that's why I think it's so important. Thank you. It is very important, and also very important to hear your cases and also learn what was the answer that you received and the threats you suffered. In a few minutes, you were able to share just one portion of what your fight was, what you've gone through. But your story, your description is extremely useful for us to understand what is happening in Mexico, what happened to you, which is it is a very famous case that motivates us to change policies so that these violations never happen again. Thank you.
After this initial round of questions for our panelists, we've heard about some of the most devastating consequences of the militarization of the war on drugs. So to complement what we've discussed, we'd like to analyze where we are right now in the region and what can be done to change this reality, to change course in the approach to dealing with violence and the problematic use of drugs, to strengthen democratic governance and human rights, and to start to repair some of the damage done and bring justice to victims. So with that in mind, we'll do one more round of questions for our panelists before opening up the floor to questions from the public. Remember that you can write in with your questions anytime in the chat, and we will review them there right after our next round of panelist questions. And we will try to be quite conscious of the time and go a bit quicker in this round to get to all of your questions. So Juliana, we're going to return to you to hear about what you're seeing right now in the region and the direction that we need to be going. En los últimos años y actualmente ha seguido.
In recent years and currently, the trend has gone towards militarization. And there are initiatives by civil society or reforms by some governments to counter this trend and reconsider how to deal with drugs, narcotics, crime, and security. So what reforms are needed? Thank you. Stephanie, I think that following what Maria de Jesus mentioned, there are many families, many people that are still suffering because of situations like the ones she has described. And I believe that this trend, unfortunately, will continue and has continued in the region in past years. And I also believe that the militarization in the context of narcotics and terrorism, as Adam has mentioned, has been also complemented by the militarization of countries' borders, specifically in the context of the COVID pandemic and that health crisis we're experiencing. A lot of countries have closed their borders, and there's been an increase in deployment of military resources in different countries in the region. I also believe that there are a lot of organizations that have submitted their cases at the ICHR reporting violation of human rights in border areas and checkpoints. And in that sense, I believe that the ICHR has issued decisions to limit the deployment of these armed forces and the military when it comes to managing these checkpoints at the border. A role and duty for which they have not been trained. And I think this is a trend that is continued in recent years and it was probably also increasing. And this situation worries us, specifically because this represents a higher risk when one delegates these roles to armed forces in a context of crisis that also has legal backing. These become procedures that are really hard to revert in the short term because we continue to delegate more responsibilities and therefore also increase the projection of the military in the political sphere with those negative consequences we've already mentioned. So war against drugs will continue to have that backing from the international community. However, there's different trends and perspectives to reform when it comes to national regulation with decriminalization and depenalization of drugs and with that focus on reparation. It's also interesting to reconsider the indicators that we use to measure the efficacy of these drug policies. We need to identify new metrics from a perspective of human rights that might also allow to include dimensions such as the impact on the health of these communities, access to justice, violence in more vulnerable areas, and how this impacts an informal economy that also merges with those legal activities. So the International Consortium on Drug Policies is compiling a global index on drug policies with this perspective. And in fact, militarization has become an obstacle rather than a solution when we try to seek realistic solutions. And those measures are justified by the use of stricter measures of security, but this also has that inverse reaction of increasing violence. So it's important also to consider those issues that are at the substance of the issues we are facing in our countries when it comes to policies related to employment, to housing, to health. And I think that using these strategies is also a symptom of a political problem, which is the lack of reform of these police forces. In this sense, we see how the police is not trained to face these problematics, and therefore we might need to invest in these trainings that uphold international human rights standards that allow us to increase the action of the police. And as Arlene mentioned, when we talk about transparency and accountability, to increase the supervision mechanisms with the participation of the civil society, documenting these procedures, allowing access to information of the military, which tend to be more obscure. But also in general terms, I think it's important also to open the debate about the aspects and characteristics that these defense systems need to adopt, to reconsider the role that we want these armed forces to have, and within the context of national defense and within the defense of democracy, and to keep those in mind when we talk about changes for which we now see militarization as a problem rather than a solution.
Thank you, Juliana. You talked about something key, which is the need to reform not only the model, but to focus on also on civilian police.
What military aid and U.S. policy in the region have looked like over past years. So building on what we've just heard from Juliana, what changes should the U.S. be making to correct course in terms of aid, training, and its role in Latin America? What would a better policy look like?
All right, I'm going to try to do this as quickly as possible because I am aware of the time, and I'm going to share my screen again so you don't have to look at me while I do it. But if I had to put a bumper sticker, quick answer to that question, I would say the United States should orient its policy toward partnering with the region on increasing state presence with the least amount of impunity possible. So state presence without impunity. And that means, first of all, if a territory in the region has a lot of drug production or drug transit or organized crime actually running people's lives, that is an indicator that the state is absent, that the government has abandoned this territory. So addressing, you have areas like in Southern Colombia where this is, you've seen these photos are from Reuters and more recently from the New York Times of places that are so abandoned that people can't get their hands on currency. They can't get pesos. And it's just easier to buy things by weighing coca paste on a scale. That level of abandonment has to stop, and that has to be an orienting principle for future U.S. programs. This goes hand in hand with the very weak credibility of institutions, of state institutions, especially civilian institutions that are supposed to be handling security and the rule of law. The approval ratings for in most Latin American countries of the armed forces, the police, but especially the justice system and Congress are super low in the Latino Barometro poll numbers that were released about 3 weeks ago. This is really alarming, and it should be guiding what we look at, what we need to partner with Latin America to help strengthen. And a big part of that, of course, are justice systems. Just increasing state presence in ungoverned areas could actually make the situation worse if the state is hopelessly corrupt or abusive. Why would you want to strengthen that? So that means way more focus on strengthening judicial systems, which currently are so ineffective that very few of them hold the powerful accountable. Instead, they put the weak or the poor in prison for a long time and call that results. We have to help Latin America change that. We've seen some experiments and experiences with judicial systems breaking ties between the state and organized crime, like the Commission Against Impunity, or CICIG, in Guatemala. But we also learned from those experiences that those mechanisms are super fragile and they need constant, reliable, long-term support and accompaniment, or else they go away, like the CICIG did in 2018. Accountability for corruption, of course, I can't get into it, but obviously it also means accountability for human rights abuse committed by military and other security forces. Finally, just when we say state presence and security, we have to keep on saying that that means way more than just people with uniforms and guns. And I'm afraid past US programs have forgotten that. You need to be talking about an entire security sector. And that means much more, as I said, courts, better run prisons, better internal control bodies, especially official government oversight bodies, both within Congress and also within other branches of government. And, you don't have a real security sector or governance unless you have really well-functioning outside oversight, also a robust media, a strong civil society, a good NGO sector, and independent experts. Building all of that is how you strengthen the state without impunity. It's expensive. It may take a generation to really build up. For entities like the US government, it means a generation of funding to some extent, but especially a generation of ironclad commitment to the reformers in the region who want to build this. You have partners who are trying to make this work. And if they do, then you can actually have a situation where the military is taken out of these internal roles and goes back to the barracks and becomes just a defense force that's called on for emergencies. A final note, just Colombia, and I don't want to steal too much thunder from Arlene, but Colombia built a decent blueprint for this state presence without impunity principle. It's certainly not perfect, the document, but the 2016 peace accord in Colombia offers some sort of roadmap. And if Colombia is willing to follow it, and the US government is willing to full-throatedly support it, it could be a really important experience for finding a way out of the model that we've sort of backed ourselves into.
Thank you, Adam. This really puts into perspective what a democratic model could and should look like. And I think in particular, what you've said about judicial systems reproducing inequality and calling that results is absolutely essential. Picking right up where Adam left off, Colombia is currently living through a historic process, historic opportunity under the peace accord. So Arlene, we'd like to ask you about this process and about your recommendations going forward. Although the US government has provided funding to support implementing Colombia's peace accord, the US has also provided hundreds of millions of dollars in military aid since the accord went into effect, much of it for military participation in counter-narcotics missions. So how has that affected the peace accord's implementation? What would be prospects for change under a new Colombian government after next year's elections? And how should the Biden administration reorient US drug control policy, including US support for the Colombian military?
If I may just take a second to refer to how Adam started his second intervention, I couldn't agree more that really the starting point for this conversation is the nature of the state, not only in Colombia, but in Latin America in general. It's my sense, and I suggested it in my first intervention, that the question of institutional state weakness is really at the root of many of the problems related to security that we're seeing in Latin America, including securitization of issues that should not be considered security matters, and including the militarization of diverse strategies to address security. This is essentially what a weak state does in terms of those problems that it translates into threats and tries to address in this fashion. And unfortunately, as one of Adam's graphs suggests, the armed forces in Latin America, along with the church, are indeed the most trusted institution across the board. And so, I think this is an important signal of alert in terms of, how we talk about the state and what needs to be done in order to create more robust states in a capacity to think about issues such as security and defense in a distinct manner. And so just to say that, going back to Colombia, I think one could say that this Colombian government's insistence, and until very recently that of the US government under Trump, on continuing the failed strategies that we've already discussed associated with the war on drugs, had a profoundly negative impact on the implementation of the peace accords, in particular in relation to the chapter on illicit drugs, not to mention the government's lack of enthusiasm, if not general opposition to many of the provisions of the agreement with FARC. And so this indeed has had a negative impact. And in particular, I would point to the languishing of pacts signed with different coca communities that were willing to, to consider alternative schemes of sustenance, have essentially, slowed down. And when we look at progress in terms of crop substitution, alternative development, we see very little. The whole question of land titling, which is at the root of the Accords, very limited progress in terms of implementation. Not to mention, in addition, the Duque government's insistence on continuing with forced aerial eradication, which fortunately now the Biden government has, set aside in terms of at least what it's pushing on paper. So I think all of this has fed into the failures that many have observed in relation to the implementation of the peace accords, in particular, again, around issues of drugs. Looking forward, I wanted to pick up on some of Adam's comments on the US. I am not sure, and I think Afghanistan is a case in point, that the US or any other northern countries should be in the business of state building and state consolidation. There's so many failures around us that it's difficult for me to make that argument. And yet, if indeed the question of the state's institutionality is at the root of some of these problems, then indeed governments such as that of the United States has to rethink how it provides assistance in a way that is conducive to not only strengthening, for instance, the coercive apparatus of the state, but the state in more general terms, as Adam has suggested. How the US goes about doing that without repeating the failures of the past, and without being tempted, to be in the business of state building in a much broader sense, I have no idea, but this definitely has to be thought through. And to the Biden government's credit, I think there is obviously, given this travesty in Afghanistan, increasing consciousness of the need to think through these failures with an eye to doing things differently and better in the future. And so that would be one thing I would mention about the US government. I'm struck, I think, partly positively by this holistic US Colombian counter-narcotics strategy, which was just announced last week. Many of the same strategies are included in this document related to security, justice, economic development. But I did want to point out, to the Biden government's credit, there's strong emphasis on comprehensive rural security and development in keeping with the peace accords. And I agree completely with Adam that on paper, the peace accord signed with FARC in Havana is one of the most progressive and enlightened documents in terms of how you go about consolidating peace and how you go about redressing some of these issues related to institutional state weakness. And again, the document that I'm mentioning actually does refer to that. And so if indeed the Duque government is either, stalling or opposed to many aspects of the peace accords, the fact that the US under the Biden government is taking a strong stance in favor of the need to continue ahead with implementation of the accords is a very positive aspect of this new strategy. Additionally, the whole emphasis on environmental protection is something fairly new, although, one notices that it emphasizes much more environmental crimes than protection per se. But I think this opens space for thinking about the US role and actually counter-narcotics policies under a distinct light. And finally, the whole mention of evidence-based prevention, treatment, harm that accompanies the more general Biden drug policy, I think, should apply equally to supply. That was one thing that I found missing in this document. Many critics of the drug war have pointed to the need to devise new strategies, more effective strategies based on the evidence. And the evidence all points to the utter failure of the war on drugs. And so I think it would be interesting if the Biden government, in keeping with its emphasis on evidence, would also then apply this to different strategies related to combating the drug supply reduction, et cetera. And finally, just 30 seconds, the prospects for change also apply to the Colombian government in the future. We have presidential elections next year. There are so many candidates right now, over 30, that it's very hard to visualize how this is all going to play out. But I would say, perhaps extremely optimistically right now, that the center and progressive sectors of Colombian society have a real chance of appointing and electing the next president of this country. And if this were the case, I think both revising counter-narcotics strategies, which many agree have been not only a failure, but tremendously counterproductive in Colombia, and pushing the need to protect the implementation of the peace accords and eventually negotiate agreements with other violent non-state actors is going to be at the center of the future government's efforts, hopefully.
Thank you, Arlene. It's good to hear that we are seeing at least some signs of hope that need to be supported on this roadmap forward. And this brings us to our final question. María de Jesús, después de escuchar sobre su caso,
after listening about your case and your family, I'm sure a lot of the people that are listening would like to hear what is the current situation and the status of your case. We understand that the Mexican government has not complied with that sentence of the Inter-American Human Rights Court, but what we wanted to learn is, what are you asking now from the Mexican government? We cannot hear you. I think you've silenced your mic. So what we're currently asking now is to find our family members. If they're alive, we would hope to find them. We don't know where they are. And we want the responsible people to be brought to justice. I believe that the government still protects them. And in the ruling, it also asks to have a public apology from the government, in which the military should also be included in that Secretariat of National Defense. And the meetings we've held after this sentence and ruling, Mr. Alejandro Insignas has committed to comply with that sentence, but we still have not managed to seek results. We have no proof of interest from the Mexican government to hear the sentence, and the National Secretariat of Defense has not contacted us. There's a lack of commitment from the side of the government. And what we want right now is just to know where they are, just to find our family. Thank you. We will be following closely what happens to your family and when it comes to that important ruling.
Public, we have already received several questions, so I will read them and then turn it over to our panelists. So one question we have sobre de una persona que está haciendo
refers to somebody that is carrying out investigation about internal displacement and disappearance of people within that war against drugs in Mexico. So what are the particular aspects you see in the Mexican case? If there is a clear example of the failure of these security strategies. And to Adam Isaacson, I would like to ask, what can we say when we ask about what would be the impact in the region of a more civil strategy? And
what concrete institutional reforms should be taking place in the area of defense to enhance civilian control of the military beyond the mere presence of a civilian minister of defense? And another question, how can governments be incentivized, in particular presidents who usually prioritize short-term solutions to push for their re-election, to push forward long-term security sector reforms? So let's take that first round of 3 questions for our panelists. So Adam, you had some specific questions directed to you. Perhaps you'd like to start off.
Sure. Primero, sobre qué hubiera sido distinto.
So first of all, what would have changed if we had more civil focused or civilian focused reform or strategy? I think that nowadays we would see less political power among the military. We would see military that are working in their responsibilities. We would see more solid governments and more civil spaces to talk about public security. With a greater participation of the civil society, we would see within those circles that I shared in my graph, stronger external circles.
That brings me to the question about concrete institutional reforms. I do lean very hard into that security sector model, that your security sector has to be far more than just the military, and that strong oversight bodies and a really active public debate, including the legislature, with a lot of civilian expertise on things like how to run a defense budget, how to evaluate threats, just what military culture is like, a more orderly back and forth with the armed forces about planning and readiness and other needs is a huge part of that. And frankly, Latin America's civilians spent much of the last 30 years showing very little interest in those issues and leaving it entirely up to the military. And that has to change. And I think foreign donors could certainly change there. That's one place where a small amount of resources could make a big difference. As far as how to incentivize governments to pursue long-term solutions from climate change to everything else, it's very, very hard in democracy. This is one of the key failures of democracy, to ensure that a policy lasts from one government to the next. We're seeing that problem with implementation of Colombia's peace accord right now. I wish I did have a better answer for that, other than trying to lock reforms into constitutions and have real consequences for not carrying them out. Ultimately, democracies are up to the vicissitudes of public opinion, and the strong incentives to show short-term results, like in Latin America, measuring drug war progress in hectares and kilograms instead of families who, for instance, who don't need to depend on the drugs in order to gain a living anymore. So that's not a satisfactory answer. I think it's a larger problem we have with democracy.
I'm going to quickly add a question into the mix that has also come in. If not internal security missions, what should be the new role of the armed forces in Latin America? Is there a way to take the military out of the war on drugs, combating gangs, etc.? Or is that wishful thinking? Let's hope not. Juliana, might you have some thoughts on this or some of the other questions?
Yes, I think that I'm going to try to answer in English. I think that some of the movements that are trying to reimagine policing in general and security in general could have some promising answers. Aside from the whole movement on defunding police, I think that we need to start thinking about what does security mean for us and what makes communities feel safe, because that might not be the police and it might not be the military. And I think that there are other factors that we need to take care of and we need to consider. And I think that what we should be pushing for is for those communities to have a seat at the table and to actually have a say in what makes them feel safe and what works for them. And I think that, one of the reforms that should also be addressed is to distinguish defense from security and to not address both problems in the same manner, because they are different in nature and they need different solutions. And I think that civil society needs to push for that and not copy models from other places that don't have the characteristics that Latin American societies have, but rather try maybe local efforts and produce better metrics, like I said, and produce better information so that we can push for governments to try and make solutions that work for our communities.
Thank you. I'll add another question that's come in, and then I think turn it over to Arlene. So the question says, Arlene Tickner is somewhat optimistic about the possibility for at least a modicum of change in drug policy by the Biden administration. Do the other panelists share this view? But I'll also let Arlene perhaps respond to that, or to any of the other questions that have come in.
Thank you for the question. It's Cynthia McClintock, who I'll say hello to, that I saw wrote it. I'm reservedly optimistic. I hope not to have given the wrong impression. I think after 50 years of a similar policy on the part of the United States, it's very hard to just turn that off and switch, right? I mean, the war on drugs sadly has been, institutionalized, and undoing that institutionalization or bureaucratization takes time. But I think we are obviously seeing signs of change in the United States, not only on the part of the Biden government, but in terms of states. The whole wave of legalization of cannabis in the United States has to promote some type of change in federal drug policy sooner or later. And so, I would say that we are seeing signs of slow change that in the Colombian case, most definitely have translated into a shift, at least in the discourse on the part of the Biden government. The fact that the government is very carefully in its official discourse emphasizing the peace accords and the implementation, and avoiding any reference to aerial fumigation, which we know has been at the root of U.S. policy in Colombia, I find very telling, especially because this is something that the Duque government itself is trying to push. So the lack of support, at least openly on the part of the Biden government, in terms of going back to that strategy, which has failed, I think is a sign of relative optimism. I just wanted to mention, echoing Adam's comments about security sector reform. I couldn't agree more with him in terms of this being at the root of the problems that we're seeing in Latin America. And just to add to what he's already said, it's not just an issue of those concentric rings, and the last point he mentions, I think, is perhaps one of the most important. There is very little civilian expertise on these issues in Latin America, and there's very little political interest in these issues in Latin America, in particular on the part of sectors of the left or progressive sectors. And so essentially, in my mind, security and defense, if and when there is political interest, essentially falls into the hands of the right. And this basically, recycles and reinforces these worrisome trends that we've discussed. So I think it's time for progressive political sectors in Latin America to take a greater interest in security sector reform and issues of security and defense, with an eye to changing the ways that we talk about these issues. And finally, the whole issue of civil society. I mean, Latin America, is also characterized by a profound crisis of democracy, skepticism towards all of these institutions, and how to rebuild trust and how to rebuild a civil society interested in participating actively in democratic debate, I think is also something, that we need to think about in terms of how to change both counter narcotic strategies, but how to change security and defense policies more generally.
Thank you. Looks like we've come to the end of our questions. We have about 60 seconds. If any of our panelists have a final thought or message or something you thought of that you didn't have a chance to say to leave us with. Or if not, because you've shared so many insightful comments and data points and analysis and recommendations with us already. So we have come to the end of our time, and we thank you all very much for joining us today. We'll leave the discussion there. This is not the end of a larger conversation, however, so to all of those listening in today, please be on the lookout for the 5th and 6th installments of our drug war webinar series in coming weeks, and we hope to see all of you again soon. So many thanks for joining us, and until next time.